It was an imposed ideology, systematically institutionalized Shia Islam in Iran. So people immediately realized that what has happened to this country is something that is going to close all the doors to the world, and it's a big prison, an open prison for everybody.
Moikka ja tervetuloa Kujalla.podcastiin. Täällä keskustellaan ajankohtaisista asioista ja teologiasta. Viime viikkoina ollaan keskusteltu paljon Iranista ja siitä, että mitä tämänhetkinen kansannousu siellä Iranissa merkitsee, mikä on kristittyjen iranilaisten rooli kaikessa tässä ja mitenkä kristityt iranilaiset toimivat ja voivat kaiken mullistuksen keskellä. Olen saanut tänään vieraakseni iranilaisen kristityn, joka on TV-tuottaja IRRTV:llä ja tekee jatkuvasti ohjelmia myös persiaksi iranilaiselle yleisölle. Nader Targizadeh, oikein paljon tervetuloa tähän ohjelmaan.
Kiitos paljon.
And now we'll switch into English so we can continue with this program. We have heard recently in the news about what is going on in Iran and about this uprising and people demonstrating on the streets. What have been your emotions about this current situation during the past few weeks?
Of course, we are all Iranians in exile and diaspora are really upset and sad about the situation, about our compatriots in Iran. And the fact is that we cannot be with them, together with them in the streets and protest and demonstrate. And that's very difficult for us. However, me personally, the first thing I did was prayer, and I asked the Lord to give us strength and wisdom to know what we should do. And what we did was my personal understanding and also my personal action was to keep calm and concentrate to what we can do about it, what's happening in Iran.
So Iran is different type of a nation, or a nation with a different type of ancestry and history compared to many of the Arabic nations that it is situated next to. So maybe it would be helpful for our audience to just give a little bit of background and backstory to where we're at now. So in 1979, there was the Islamic Revolution, and the country came under Sharia law, so the Islamic rule of law. But before that, what was Iran like, and how did maybe Islam become the dominant religion in Iran?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Iran is one of the world's oldest continuous civilizations, shaped by the Achaemenid, Parthians, and Sasanian empires, and entered to the modern era under Pahlavi monarchy, with an emphasis on nation building, secular governance, expanded education, and engagement with the West. Despite its problems, the Pahlavi period was fundamentally a nation-state project rooted in Iranian identity rather than religious ideology. The 1979 Islamic Revolution marked, as you said, a decisive rupture between this trajectory. The establishment of the Islamic Republic under so-called Velayat Faqih, which means like rule of the Islamic jurist, transformed Iran into a theocratic system in which clerical authority replaced people sovereignty. Since then, public life has been regulated by religious law, political dissent criminalized, women's and personal freedoms reduced, and religious minorities, especially Christian converts, treated as ideological security threats rather than citizens. But Iran in that region is a non-Arab country with a Persian majority population, around 60% Persian speakers, Farsi, but it is also a diverse multi-ethnic society. Alongside Persians, Farsi speakers, there are large communities like Azeris, around 20%, which I'm coming from that region. Kurds, 10%. We have Lords, 6-7%. Arabs, 2%. Baluchs, as well as historic Christian minorities such as Armenians and Assyrians, who we live all together in the same country. The national and official language of Iran is Farsi, Persian, which connects all these many different groups within a shared cultural and historical framework. Even though many also speak their own local languages at home, but we are connected through this national language to each other. While the modern Iranian nation historically evolved around Persian culture and language, as you said, Shia Islam introduced through a conquest by Arabs and later institutionalized by the Safavid, which become the unifying state ideology rather than an organic cultural choice for all of its people. In today's Middle East, Iran stands apart as the principal Shia power in a largely Sunni region, positions at the crossroad of the Persian Gulf, Central Asia. Yet many Iranians increasingly distinguish between this imposed ideological role and their own desire to pluralistic nation that reflects Iran's ethnic diversity, cultural depth, and aspiration for peaceful, normal relations with its neighbors and the wider world, especially with Israel and America.
So, and in 1979, when the Islamic Revolution took place, what was the average Iranian's attitude towards that? Was it a welcomed change, or were most people objecting to it?
Well, that's a very good question. I was born in 1979, so I haven't witnessed this history and this revolution. But we have a lot of. I've watched many documentaries from that era. No, it was not welcomed by Iranian people because it was, as I said earlier, it was an imposed ideology. Not even religion. It was an imposed ideology, systematically institutionalized Shia Islam in Iran. So people immediately realized that what has happened to this country is something that is going to close all the doors to the world, and it's a big prison, an open prison for everybody.
Many left-wing philosophers and politicians in the West, in Europe, even in Finland, actually supported this revolution. Do you have any knowledge of this, why they resonated so much with this idea of revolution?
Yes, that's actually very. I'm not a historian, but I've read about it. I'm not a politician, but I've read about this, and I was interested to know why. Even some French philosophers really were pro this situation of the Islamic Revolution. And my understanding, today it proves that that was correct, is that most of those leftists who are supporting Islamic regime of Iran is because Islamic regime of Iran is against Israel and Jewish people. That's the main reason, with no understanding of what is this Shia Islam or this Islamic radicalist revolutionary people in Iran. They're supporting them. The only main reason is that mutual reason they have is to wipe up the Israel from the map of the world. That's what I think connects all of them together.
So, if we then go a little bit even further back in history, what do we know about Iran from biblical history or from the Bible? Is Iran mentioned there somehow?
Oh yeah, definitely. Most probably, most of the Christians who read Bible, they know about it, and they have seen the name Cyrus, Cyrus the Great. In the Bible, ancient Iran appears primarily as Persia, often portrayed as a major imperial setting where God's purposes unfold through history. As I said, Cyrus the Great is singled out for allowing Jewish exiles to return and rebuild. I think it's in the Ezra first, if I'm not mistaken. So Persia is the context for like Esther story of deliverance, and Daniel serves within successive empires that include the Medo-Persian realm, and also the very good story that many Europeans, especially in Finland, I realized haven't heard, is the Magi, the wise men from the east who seek Jesus, are traditionally associated with the broader Persian sphere, and the biblical arc consistently shows that God is at work even in powerful empires, using rulers, courts, and unexpected people to protect and advance his redemptive plan. So yeah, that's the history. I will maybe later tell you about these mags history in Iran also.
Yeah, so Iran has a very long, interesting history, and it's even mentioned in the Bible. And Iran is a very significant player in the Bible and biblical stories as well. Well, what is the Christian history of Iran? Of course, it's majority Islamic, and it was not always Islamic. Were there Christians in the early days of the church, or how does it play out?
As I said earlier, Christianity has very deep roots and goes back to the first centuries after Christ. Early Christian communities existed in Persian lands long before Islam and developed their own traditions, often called the Persian or Eastern Church, which spread faith and learning across the region and into Asia. One of the oldest churches in the world is called Saint Mary Church, which is located in Urumia, where I'm coming from, the city in northwest of Iran. And according to tradition, was built with one of the Magi who visited Jesus. Iran is also is home to Saint Thaddeus Monastery, known as Kare Kilisa, which means a black church. That's another story about it. In Iran's West Azerbaijan province, again in northwest of Iran, which is one of the world's oldest Christian monasteries, founded in 66 AD, and a UNESCO World Heritage since 2008, traditionally linked to the Apostle Thaddeus. So here we see that apostles came through Iran, they evangelized, and they spread the gospel in Iran. Over time, Armenians and Assyrian Christians became established communities in Iran with their own churches, with their own languages, and their own worship life. Although their freedom has risen up and down under different rulers, Christianity has always been part of Iran's history long before the Islamic State. Actually, I lived in a region, as I said, northwest of Iran, Urumia, where the St. Mary's Church is. I lived with the ethnic groups of Christians, Armenians, and Assyrians together and grown up with them.
So you have this long Christian history, and then at some point, Arabic people came with Islam and brought Islam into the area or into Iran, and then it became the majority religion during that point in history.
Yeah, Islam entered Iran through, as I said, Arab conquests in the 7th century, which ended the Sasanian Empire and gradually reshaped Iran's religious landscape over several centuries. Conversion was not instantaneous, but occurred through a mix of political change, economical incentives, social integrations, and a spread of Islamic institutions, which was very important and still is the strongest thing in current 47 years happened in Iran. And Iran later became a global center of 12 Shiism, as you said in the beginning, when the Safavid dynasty adopted it as the state religion in the early 16th century. So decisively differentiating Iran from many neighboring Sunni majority societies and embedding Shia clerical fluence deeply into governance and culture.
So you have mentioned the Sunni and Shia Muslim different traditions. So maybe if you could explain what would be helpful for us as Finnish people to understand what is the difference between Shiite and Sunni Muslims.
Yeah, I can't very detailed. I can't give you very detailed information about it because it is through a lot of wars and histories between how Shiism appeared and what was the Sunnism. But the main difference is between the imams, as they say, the 12 imams that they have, and also the belief of the Prophet Muhammad is mutually accepted by both of them. But the difference and the disagreement is in these traditions and how many imams they had, and there was a fight between one of the imams with their Sunni imams. So that was a dispute traditionally rather than the generally different kind of Quran or Prophet Muhammad. So they both believe in Quran and they both believe in Prophet Muhammad. The difference is traditionally in the imams mainly.
Okay. Well, let's go in a minute more detail to the Christian, the situation of the Christians in Iran. But I also want to ask you, Iran is also in connection with, or has been supporting financially Hezbollah and Hamas and the Houthis in Yemen. So there is this. Because from here in Finland, we might think that, okay, everyone here in the Middle East, they're all Muslims and they're all wanting the same thing, but it's not exactly true. So maybe you could just explain what is Iran's political motivation to support some of these terrorist groups and what is its aim and how do other maybe Middle Eastern nations view these pursuits?
That's a very, very good question, but also very sensitive politically in terms of connecting to terrorist groups and who identifies them as terrorists or not. Here, as I said, Iranian nations are non-Arab nations, Persians, and we should differentiate between Islamic Republic of Iran, which is the forced government for Iranians, and Iranian nation, Iranian people. So there is a difference between these two. If we say supporting terrorist groups like Hamas and Hezbollah and Houthis or whatever in the region, which are proxy militia for Iran to fight with Israel and Jews, that's the Islamic Republic, Islamic Revolutionary Guard of Iran. It's not the Iranian people. So Iranian people are totally against supporting any kind of terrorist groups like Hamas, Hezbollah, and Houthis or any other groups. The fact is that we know all Iranians who are living in Iran, they know that our money, resources are given to these groups to fight something that we don't want to fight. The ideology of the radical Islamists of government, that's what they want to achieve, not our people. That's the reason 47 years Iranian people got hostage, and they lost a lot of resources only for the reason that they want to build an Islamic empire equivalent that, according to Supreme Leader Khamenei, that he believes he's the Pope of the Muslims in the world, and he's connected directly to God. That he wants to build the empire of Islam in the world, but Iranian people are against it. Iranian people don't like to support any terrorist groups.
Mm. Yes, so important to make that distinction between what the Islamic government wants to do and what the people want to do, the people of Iran want to do. Okay, so then about the Christians, the Christian minority in Iran. So there is this long history of Christianity. There are old churches, old monasteries, old denominations like Armenian Christians that are in Iran. But in the last about 50 years, how has it been for Christians? I know that recently there are more Christians in the country, but how has it been in the last 50 years?
Yeah, in one of my interviews for my podcasts with Pastor Tat Stewart, who was a missionary in Iran, I asked a question that what happened to Iran, that the Christianity grown after Revolution 1979. The answer was really interesting because Iranian people, many Iranians have become disappointed with the forced religion. Previously, before 79, it wasn't forced religion. You could become a Christian or Muslim or whatever you want, or atheist even, secular. So many Iranians have become disappointed with the forced religion, especially when faith is tied to state control, corruption, and violence. In this context, the message of Jesus, love, grace, forgiveness, and a personal relationship with God feels very different from religion used as power, just like Iran. Persian language media, satellite TV, the internet, and the Iranian diaspora have also made it easier for people to learn about Christianity. So it helped people to understand and differentiate between these two, that Christianity is not a religion. Christianity is a personal relationship with God. And now they understand what is Christianity. Christianity is not being an Armenian or a Syrian. I remember that when I said I converted to Christian, someone Iranian relative told me, "So you became Armenian?" I said, "No, Armenian is an ethnic group. Christianity is a belief that you build a personal relation with God." So many Iranians share personal stories and testimonies, and they answered prayers, healing, or strong inner calling, which becomes especially meaningful in a country where openly choosing faith can come at a high risk and cost.
So how many Christians are there today approximately in Iran? Like what's the number, approximate number?
There is, we can't, that's one of the biggest problems we have, that we cannot get, because we don't have access to field research, we cannot get accurate number of people, Christians, converted Christians in Iran. So what I can say is that Iran is the fastest growing underground church in the world. We know this through trusted sources that are connected to underground churches, and the reason that they cannot leak out the numbers and information because it's insecure to leak it out. But we know that Iran is the fastest growing underground church.
And was there, like, in the last 50 years, was there a moment when the tide kind of turned, and then after that, more and more people started to become Christians?
Well, there was no turning point, I guess. As I said earlier, it was a gradually and slowly going process. It is a process, which I guess, I believe personally, this is my personal belief, that today, in these 3 weeks that we are witnessing, this is the turning point for Iranians who extremely believed in Islam. Today they understand the difference between Islam and Christianity. But this was a process. In the process, people got frustrated for many different reasons. Just I can give you one single example, for example, coming to my mind, that you don't have freedom to express yourself, or you don't have freedom to believe in something that you want to believe. And maybe your child has been arrested just because he or she was holding a Bible, and he or she is in prison just because he was holding a Bible. Then the entire families engage with this, and then they realize, wow, this is what is this that the Islamic regime is afraid of? Is this the Bible? Why they're afraid of this Bible? What is in it? So they engage, they want to read about it, and then they want to hear about it. And when they hear there is forgiveness, there is love, and there is a grace, our God is a graceful God and forgiving God, then they say this is a huge difference. So it was a process by experiencing the difficult life under Islamic government. Yeah.
Mm. What are the means by which the Iranians come to faith? Yeah, what are the different ways?
Yes, as I said earlier, it's the satellite TV, radio, the media that are broadcasting to Iran, personal relations with the diaspora, Christians in diaspora like us, exiled people, and the pastors in exile in the diaspora. So these are the means Iranians are connected. And also today I can strongly say social media, because social media plays a very important role in connecting Iranians and knowing Jesus through social media.
And if you become a Christian and you live in Iran, what is life for you like?
When you convert from Islam to any other religion, that's against the law of Shia. And the law of Shia is law of the government. So that means persecution. Persecution in Iran frequently is administrative and judicial, rather than openly saying religious in name. Believers, especially converts, can be summoned, interrogated, monitored, dismissed from employment, threatened to renounce faith, or arrested under a broad national security style accusation, and house churches may be raided and personal devices be searched and taken away. Reports by right organizations like Article 18, for example, and advocacy groups consistently describe patterns of detention, harsh interrogation, intimidation of families, threatening families, and prison sentences, particularly targeting converts and leaders of HUOM fellowships.
Hmm. So what are the local Iranian churches like? What can you tell us about what church life is like?
Well, I have never experienced any church life myself in Iran, but what I can say is that when we say church in Iran, there are two kinds of church. One is the officially recognized Armenian and Assyrian church, which is for ethnic groups of Armenian and Assyrians, and they're highly monitored by the government. So any non-Christian cannot enter to those churches. So that story is totally different. And when we say church in Iran, we are talking about underground church. underground or house churches are highly secured and highly hidden from everyone. And the only people who can enter and go there are trusted people through trusted friends or relatives or those who you know. So, however, from the testimonies we receive from our viewers, from friends, from pastors that we have here, they have connections. They gather in these house churches. They have I don't know which days, maybe on Fridays or Sundays, depending on the house church. They gather together secretly. They worship. They do the church ceremony from the beginning to the end, and they get baptized in these churches, and they have Holy Communion in these churches, and they worship to God, and they send a lot of testimonies to different satellite televisions, radios, pastors, and organizations in exile. This is all information I can tell you. I have never personally witnessed any church. Actually, in my childhood, it was my dream to visit the St. Mary Church or one of the churches.
Well, hopefully one day you will actually be able to do that. Well, about the current situation now with the political uprising, what is the Christian Iranians' view about this? Are they participating actively also in the demonstrations, or are they more on the sidelines? Do you have any information about this?
If you're talking about Christians, converted Christians or Christians inside Iran, I have no information about that. And I believe not many people have information about it. But I can say that yes, they do that. I know many Armenian Christian friends. They are participating inside Iran. And matter of fact, I heard from a journalist, a friend of mine who is a journalist, Armenian in Belgium. He told me that confirmed over 7 Armenian Christians who were participating in the protest were killed, and the church leaders believe there are many of them who were in the protest and they were killed, arrested. About convert Christians, we don't have information because it is dangerous to even talk about it and say I was converted Christian and I was participated in the protest. So that's a very different situation. But if we say about the Christians in exile or diaspora like us, we Christians in diaspora are largely united in prayer. That was one of the main things we did, standing with our people in Iran. Nevertheless, as I mentioned earlier, alongside prayer, many of us have taken an active role, public role, as a voice for Iranian living under near total information blackout, organizing peaceful gatherings in front of EU parliaments across Europe, demonstrating outside the Islamic regime of Iran's embassies, and engaging with media, churches, and civil society. We also share verified stories and updates from inside Iran with Western politicians and decision makers who can influence policy and accountability. While this struggle continues, there is a growing sense that these efforts have reached the world to some extent, bringing attention, pressure, and solidarity to Iranian people's call for freedom and dignity. Probably you have heard recently in European Parliament, they've voted to recognize Islamic Revolutionary Guard as a terrorist group. So that was one of the things which I'm thankful. We are all Iranians thankful to European Parliament member from Finland, Mr. Sebastian, who is actively working on that. And I guess this was a success to be voice for our compatriots from Iran.
Mm. So the demonstrations have been going on for about 3, 4 weeks now that we're recording this. What do you think will happen next? Where will this lead?
Well, I guess it's very difficult to predict what's going to happen next. However, according to analysis and the news and the analysts, politicians, and the trusted sources, we are trying to read between lines of all these information we receive, is that Iranian people are unarmed, protesting in the streets, fighting with a regime fully armed with military, and in matter of fact, they brought over 5,000 militia who they trained from Iraqis, to kill Iranian people in the streets. So Iranian people are confronting military, Islamic radical military, who are killing them. What Iranian people need is, unfortunately, intervention of foreign military, which United States is apparently, according to news, what we are hearing, they are located around the Middle East, in Persian Gulf, and in the border of Iraq. And there is a plan. We heard that they are going to attack not Iranian people, but the Islamic Revolutionary Guard, to destroy them and take them out of the country. That's what's going to happen. To our predictions, that's people are hoping to happen. However, after that, we are praying and hoping for a smooth transition with a new leader and a new government, which it looks like we have someone, an alternative for that, which is the former Prince Pahlavi, Reza Pahlavi, and he's a decent guy. And people have historical root with the Pahlavi dynasty because of the situation of the Iran connected to West, and very well developed. So people are unifying each other through a symbolic figure of the Prince Pahlavi. And in his speeches, he's talking about democracy, he's talking about human rights, he's talking about freedom of speech and referendum, that he says, I'm not coming to rule, I'm coming there to open the platform for everybody, all the parties, political parties, to come and give the ground to people to vote for anyone they are desiring. So that's it. Foreseeing, at least for us, and we are hoping and praying that's going to happen smoothly.
Okay, thank you. We will continue to pray, and these are maybe good prayer requests that you have now here talked about, that we can support the Iranian people and be praying alongside you.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, please pray to Iran to be free from an imposed theocratic regime and become a democratic nation where people can live in peace, dignity, and freedom of conscience. Pray for protection for civilians, detainees. We have many thousands of detainees, and grieving families who lost their loved ones, especially very young people under 18, and for an end to this violence, fear, and enforced silence. Pray especially for the underground church, that it would be strengthened, united, and ultimately free to worship openly, and for seekers across Iran to encounter Jesus, growing faith, and one day worship without fear in our own land.
Amen. Good prayer request. Thank you so much, Nader Targizadeh, and God bless you in your work as you produce TV programs about Jesus as well.
Thank you very much, Heidi, for inviting me. God bless you.
God bless. Ja kiitos kaikille kuulijoille ja katselijoille. Palautetta voi lähettää osoitteeseen kujalla.podcast@gmail.com ja jos haluat tukea tämän ohjelman tekemistä, niin se onnistuu osoitteessa patreon.com/kujalla. Ja palataan asiaan ensi kerralla.